We welcome you once again to this series of webinars that are a joint collaboration between the Canadian Association of Sociology of Education. Our colleague, Dr. Isil Yoon from the University of Manitoba, is not with us today because the University of Manitoba is on strike. So we send her solidarity and warm thoughts today as she pickets in sunny Manitoba. Also, my co-chair, Dr. Alana Butler, joins us today from the Canadian Sociological Association, our Sociology of Education Research Cluster. So we welcome you. Today's topic is around the concept and experiences in experiential learning. We welcome our two presenters, Emerson Lacroix from the University of Waterloo. He is a PhD candidate there, and also Dr. Alison Taylor from the University of British Columbia. We'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. We want to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. We invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside at the website posted there. I would just like to acknowledge I'm joining you today from New Brunswick, where I live and work on the traditional and unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq peoples. During each presentation, you can make comments in the chat, but just remember that only panelists can view your comments. And so the chat is for, any just like side comments, or if you want to let someone know that you're there and you support them, you can do that in the chat. For questions, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A. And when we get to that Q&A section, we will be going through those and presenting them to our presenters today. So if you forget and put a question in the chat, we will probably gently remind you to make sure that question goes in the Q&A. Also, just a reminder that you can activate closed captioning. So if you see that button at the bottom that says CC live transcript, if you need closed captioning, you can click on that and that will be an added support. Okay, so I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Emerson Lacroix, to present his research. I'll let him the title and everything.
Thanks, Kathleen. I'm just gonna share screen. And I think that's come through.
It looks good.
Okay. Well, I'm very excited to be here sharing some research that I've done on experiential education. This research was originally undertaken as a component of my master's degree, my master's thesis at the University of Waterloo. And recently I've sort of reformatted it a bit to publish in the Journal of Experiential Education. So if you're interested in the actual article itself, it is open access, Organizational Complexities of Experiential Education. And so the way that I approach experiential education is a little bit different than the way that other scholar practitioners or different types of theorists have approached the topic, is that I look at it from an organizational lens. So I thought to begin, since we're talking about, this is the topic of the day, experiential education, experiential learning, that it'd be good to sort of begin by disaggregating these two concepts to have some conceptual footing of the types of discussions that we're having. So experiential education is really rooted in, the educational philosophy that values learning by doing. So if we're talking about experiential education, it's that, that pedagogical type philosophy, okay? And then when we're talking about experiential learning, in addition to that, it's about the particular modes. So talking about experiential learning is, we're rooted in concepts like, co-op, internships, service learning, all the particular modes that learning by doing is accomplished through. And sometimes you even see a further distinction between experiential learning and work integrated learning. So the difference, easy sort of distinction is that experiential learning, then if we're contrasting the two, takes place in an educational setting, and work integrated learning takes place in a work or a simulated work environment. So that's your co-op and apprenticeships and things like that. So I thought that would be a useful sort of spot to just start with to make sure that we have the terms right. And what's been done so far, it's a good idea to sort of get a sense of a lay of the land, is that when we look at literature on experiential learning, it's often siloed by discipline, okay? So it's valuable for scholar practitioners who might be, if we're talking about a sociological context, to look to the left and to the right of you to see what other scholars have done. And so it'd be in something like, teaching sociology, the journal, or if you're in computer science, like computer education, right? So very disciplinary siloed pockets of this is how I, as a sociologist, implemented experiential learning in this sociology class, okay? And then another route is more pedagogical type thinking. So this is where, scholarship of teaching and learning also intersects, where we're talking about particular pedagogical models. Anyone that's interested, like the Cole model of experiential learning comes up a lot as a way to structure these learning activities within your course. So they can be a good spot to go for if you're learning this for the first time or approaching this for the first time, to see how this could actually be done in a course context. And then a third form is about, or a third pocket of literature is really about the particular forms of experiential learning. So really forwarding discussion about something maybe like community-based learning. So if you wanted to do that as an activity in your course, you could look specifically for how other people have done experiential learning, community-based learning, to see, what does this actual pedagogical approach look like? So that's, neat three buckets to put them in. And of course, there's overlap and there's no clear distinctions all the time, but that's a way that I sort of think about it. And while these are great and they're extremely valuable, we can sort of approach these as little microcosms, right? Where they have value in and of itself. But if we wanted to be a little more systematic in the way that we think about this as a process, why are we doing these things? How does this look like across the field of higher education? This is what I'm starting to think about, right? These experiential education as an organizational process, not just a pedagogical one. So this is that thinking beyond pedagogy. I have here that from my article, despite the broad emphasis that experiential education has in university settings, it's sort of taken for granted about why we're doing these things. So it's not always clearly communicated in the literature why we're doing this. So if we ask as a process of institutionalization how this works, we can unpack some pretty interesting findings. And you might say, well, why does this matter then? In Ontario, where I am and where my research is situated to start, we have these strategic mandate agreements that work between the provincial government and Ontario universities, where the government sets priorities and universities liaise these priorities and say how they're going to accomplish them through these mandate agreements. And experiential education is actually one of these new funding metrics that's developed. So we have three generations of what I call funding metrics, or of strategic mandate agreements. And now we have these funding metrics that have come into play. So if the government is signaling that you need to be doing experiential education, and up to 60% of your post-secondary funding or your university funding can be tied to these metrics, well, then this is something that universities really do need to be responding to. And so as an institutional process, this is where we're coming from, right? Like, well, how does this play out across the field, and how do universities respond to it? And the way that I approached this from a theoretical stance was through the institutional logics perspective. And I know not everyone is probably as interested in organizational theory, maybe as I am, so I'll endeavor to make this clear, that the institutional logics, if we think of social institutions, right, as sociologically, social institutions, institutional logics are the macro level, think like, the rules of the game for how these particular social institutions should be done, okay? So if we're talking about education, how should education be done? It's the macro level, rules, standards, and values that shape and condition behaviors within social institutions. And when we talk about higher education, for example, oftentimes we see, the managerial and the academic logic. Different terms might be neoliberal versus liberal approaches to education, right? There's these terms that are thrown around, but broad strokes, it's about the values that each have. So where a managerial logic might be a little bit more about program numbers and financialization of higher education. And academic logic is more a republic of scholars, free inquiry, thinking for the sake of thinking, being with ideas. Cote and Alahar talked about this in their famous Ivory Tower Blues, saying that corporatization is winnowing its way into higher education, and it impacts the way that academics carry out their roles. And there actually are, repercussions for this, these different tensions between these two logics, where, Paul Gooch talked about the fact that universities have become distracted from their knowledge base, their knowledge claims, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right? We're supposed to be knowledge institutions. So if we have these tensions that play at the institutional level about how education should be done, there's some repercussions for the identity and the goals and the roles of universities. And this is a great way to think about things, but we also know, as sociologists, we're interested in ideas of structure and agency, right? So if this is a quite structuralist approach, well, organizational actors aren't just, cultural dopes, as they're sometimes called in organizational literature, where they just carry on the ideology of the institution. They have their own professions and ideas that shape the way that they approach their roles. So this is where a micro level analysis is valuable at a professional logics level. How do different professional actors across university campuses make sense of their roles in relation to an institutional logic that they might be aligned or not aligned with? And this is that concept of logic work that I have at the bottom that I'm trying to sort of like work with and think about, where as a process of organizational bricolage, right? How do organizational actors at the base make sense of competing institutional logics? And how might that also be complicated by the individuals that they're working with across the university at the technical core, to use an organizational term? So the question becomes then, how do competing institutional logics influence the institutionalization of experiential education? If this is a top-down sort of priority or an administrative type priority that's being signaled from the government, well, how does it percolate and level down through the organizational level and have successful institutionalization? To get at this question, I did a case study, okay? So I picked a new experiential education certificate program at a research-intensive university in the province. I've, of course, de-identified, and I use pseudonyms for these programs in this university. The caveat, of course, is that this program was in its first year, but a case study allows us to make some inferences and maybe develop some assumptions about the way that a unit of analysis is representative of a broader social process. So if we look at something like this particular program, how is this emblematic of the broader institutional forces at play regarding experiential education? And I used multiple qualitative methods to accomplish this. The content analysis really was about, okay, how is this program officially framed? And then the interviews were talking with different professional groups around campus when it came to this program, to see, how do different professional groups respond to experiential education? A little brief tidbit about the program itself was that it was there were curricular components, so these experiential education courses that students could take in different disciplines. And there was also a co-curricular piece. There were different workshops that they could work towards getting sort of a fuller toolkit of experiential education. But because I was interested in how it impacts the technical teaching and learning operations, I focus more so on the curricular side. And so, what are the findings? These are, again, findings of talking to individuals and looking at the content of the way that this program is framed. Well, the first is that, if you look only at documents, you'll find a very tightly coupled, neatly packaged program that officially responds to institutional pressures to show that the university is taking experiential education seriously. It works across different disciplinary lines, so it's woven into the fabric of the institution. And when talking to the people who operate, maybe in this more managerial logic, these professional development officers, like their goal is to get this program as diffuse across the institution as possible. So this is what they're looking to do. What was interesting, though, is because it was also, just starting up, the course inclusion into this program was on a pre-approval basis. So these were courses that were pre-existing the program itself. So then you start to think, well, maybe this is just old wine in new bottles, right? A new label for old wine. So how do faculty respond to this? If you ask a different constituent group on campus, a different professional group, they're the ones that are teaching these courses, so they must have some ideas about this. And this is where, challenges and organizational complexity come into play, because lots of faculty, although they did talk about the value that experiential education had and how it, students seem to be benefiting from it and liking it, they talked about the challenges they face as working professionals and how including experiential learning really impacted their professional role and how they saw their own professional goals, right? The transformation of their profession. Or you could say a transformation of their professional logic. So they talked about, things like the amount of time that it takes. Using experiential learning is much more timely. A lack of familiarity with the pedagogy itself. This is not the way I learned when I was a student, so now I'm being expected to take this on. And I should also say that many of these faculty members didn't implement this experiential learning into their courses by their own pedagogical mindset. They took over these courses that were already imbued with experiential learning. So for example, they were new hires, they were allocated to these courses. So it wasn't something that they necessarily implemented on their own fruition. And what this comes down to as well is contrast in the way that professional logics are legitimized in institutional settings. And what I mean by that is that some of the faculty would know, this doesn't count for teaching and promotion. Advanced teaching methodologies such as this aren't evaluated for me the same way that my research is. So this points to the fact that, well, if institutionalization of experiential education is important from a institutional perspective for universities, well, then we need to think about the ways in which it's legitimated for the people that are implementing it. And this sort of tension between the two professional logics at play, the academic faculty level one and the professional development one that was driving this program, opens up what Whitchurch calls a third space, right? So, we don't have these neat institutional pillars that have no crossover or interaction across the two. But nonetheless, there is this space in the middle that the two parties, not like a bargaining agreement table, but something akin to that, right? Where there needs to be some cross discussion across professional lines about why we're doing it and why we're not. Of course, these discussions have been going on forever. Cote and Alahar, this is what their stuff is rooted in, not maybe from using organizational language, but the fact that there's these tensions within institutional settings. And so this is what I'm getting at, where the value of experiential education might be there, but implementation might be harangued by these organizational complexities that could stand in the way of it. So that was sort of broad strokes, the finding of this research so far. And it really does inform the way that I'm approaching thinking about experiential education for my doctoral dissertation. So what will that look like? I wanted to give you a little bit of a teaser. The case study was great. It was a neat little, neat package with a bow on it. We had some, pretty straightforward findings, but nonetheless, it's a case of a larger institutional process that's happening across the field of Ontario universities. So if we think about well, this is just how one university responded in one instance. Let's think about it from a field level perspective. And how do different types of universities respond to this? So this is what I'll be looking at, is taking a snapshot of a couple different types of universities. And by different types, I mean, the primarily undergraduate ones, comprehensive ones, doctoral universities. Are there institutional differences in the way that different institutional types respond to the perceived value and the government direction on experiential education? And that's at the top level, right? Like that's at the administrative level to a degree. And we can use the strategic mandate agreements as a content analysis, again, study how over time these specific universities have responded. But then there's also, well, there's different disciplines within universities, right? So it might be that really applied and regulated disciplines, like something like engineering, have an easier time with experiential learning than something maybe like English or geography. So that's a second component of this upcoming research, is to look at disciplinary distinctions. If we look at English across the three institutional types, are there differences in the way that disciplines respond to this? And then a third component as well is that professional sense making, continuing on with this idea of a professional logic. How do faculty across different disciplines think about experiential education? Is it something they're interested in at all? Is it something that it's like, this is interesting, but maybe a tenured faculty could take this on, I'm still trying to get tenure? Or is it, these are the up and coming people from a tenured faculty perspective? It's the people that are up and coming that have time to learn about these advanced teaching methodologies. So how do different faculty types across different institutions, across different disciplines make sense of this? So we have an institutional level, a disciplinary level, and a professional level distinctions. And that's sort of everything that I have to say. I wanted to make sure that I kept it within my time. I'm very happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session. And I think I can pass it over to Dr. Taylor for her presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emerson. I enjoyed the research you presented, but I'm also looking forward to the teaser you gave us, because
teaser.
Yeah, especially the disciplinary distinctions, because I teach in an education department, and that would look very different. I anticipate that would look very different than what you might find in other disciplines. So I welcome our second presenter, Dr. Alison Taylor, and we'll just wait a moment while she gets set up.
I think I'm good.
Okay, great. There you go. It looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thanks to Emerson for his presentation. I also wanted to acknowledge that I work at UBC on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And I also wanted to begin by just thanking the organizers for the webinar series that is being developed this year. I think it's great, and I'm happy to participate. So thanks to Kathleen, Alana, Isul, and Sherry for all the work you're doing. So I am going to talk about a paper that I've been working on. And it's also, so my presentation is based on something in process, and also a forthcoming chapter based on a study of undergraduate students and their part-time work, or their term time work, as is often called. Now the title then is Being There, Rhythmic Diversity in Working Students. And you might ask, why focus on time in a study of students in term time work? And I'll explain that to start. First of all, as we know, the cost of education keeps going up. And there's been a significant increase over time in the number of Canadian undergraduates who work while studying full time. As part of our study, we did a 2018 survey, which found that 55% of full-time undergraduate students at a large research-intensive university worked while studying for an average of 14 hours a week. And of course, that 14-hour average covers a lot of diversity in terms of students' work patterns. And so one can assume that many students are likely to be work pressured. Students are also expecting and expected to be investing in the future through higher education. They're advised to participate in student clubs, recreational activities, cultural events, learn experientially through exchanges, and we just actually start, they're expected to do a lot. Learn experientially through exchanges, internships, and cooperative education programs. This is actually from a slide from one of the graphic stories that we are doing based on student work, based on our interviews with students. However, of course, the pace of academic life feels to many scholars and others as if it's speeding up, sparking a movement for slow scholarship, or at the very least a 6-day week. And of course, the neoliberal work context for faculty, sessional instructors, and staff is the study context for students. So it seems to me that a focus on time makes sense, but how to think about time? One strand of literature looks at capitalism and time. In his article, for example, an older article, Time, Work, Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, social historian E.P. Thompson described the way industrial workers become habituated to the discipline of clock time as something to be budgeted, consumed, and put to use. And this slide is more related to a recent article by Brian Palmer, who suggests that capitalist time continues to be an area of struggle to this day. He compares the workday to an elastic band that capitalism constantly tries to stretch. So, and finally, I wanted to mention Lauren Berlant because I've been influenced by her work, and she says, suggests that in our globalized economy, bodies and lives are increasingly saturated by capitalist forces and rhythms. But of course, tensions are evident in even thinking about time due to changing modes of production and their shifting chronologics, if we're talking about time and capitalism. For example, industrial capitalism is equated with equates time and money with time with money and worker productivity with a given level of output per hour. Mass production was usually associated with routinized and standardized labor. Post-industrial, flexible production and the knowledge economy, on the other hand, valorize flexibility, adaptability, high skills, and innovation. Workers are said to require high tolerance for ambiguity and must keep learning to stay employable, and are often paid by the task rather than the hour. I'll cite Ogle, who talks about the following features of contemporary work, and he includes the destandardization of working hours and work rhythms since the 1970s, the gradual introduction of work from home with important gendered implications. Of course, interestingly, they were writing before COVID, but we see that even more, and other schemes emphasizing flexibility. The impact of instant communication technologies that make geographical location, or rather time zone of a workplace, less relevant, and the waning and replacement of certain sociotemporal and even natural rhythms such as day and night. Think of the books called 24/7. So, but despite despite knowledge economy or gig economy ideas about any time, any place, work and learning, it's clear that old and new chronologics exist. On one hand, there are more calls for flexibility in learning and portable credentials for lifelong learners. Students are expected to take responsibility for their time use and develop a portfolio of transferable employability skills. I'm sure you're familiar with that discourse. On the other hand, the time logic of industrial capitalism is still evident in universities as well as many workplaces, and I think we can attest to that as well. So the rhythms of academic life are evident in the academic calendar, days divided into well-defined time blocks and semesters marked by midterms and exams. Policies normatively frame the rhythms of youth's everyday lives around expected trajectories. Student progress is typically measured in terms of classroom hours and course credits, as well as student self-reports of time spent on their studies. We ourselves, in our initial discussion with students, asked them how they allocate their time and how they spend their time in terms of different activities. Students are encouraged to work hard, be expert time managers, and become credentialized for professional work. In our study, allusions to clock time and time as money, it's pretty clear, permeate student discourse. They constantly spoke about wasting time, spending time, losing time, and managing time more effectively. And of course, a lot of talk as well about productivity. Contemporary, so what is time? Again, that's not as simple a question as we might think. Contemporary writings subvert commonplace ideas about time as a linear process captured by clocks and calendars. Instead, time is seen as a human construct that is dynamic, multidimensional, multifaceted, interdependent with space, and subjectively experienced. So I've noted a few authors here who are commonly cited in the literature. And so social thinkers have developed concepts like time-space, Barbara Adam, 1998, timescape, I should say, time-space, John May and Nigel Thrift, and Henri Bergson with his ideas around duration are cited in some of the kind of sociology of education and more social theory literature. Education has also been looking at, interestingly, turned to this area of literature. And so empirical studies in education have examined students' temporal dispositions, socio-demographic differences in student timescapes, the timescape of employability, the quality of student time, and so on. And so there is a growing literature that I found very interesting to come across. I want to say, however, that my work draws on Henri Lefebvre's work on rhythms, which of course is related to time, because it helps me understand students' everyday transitions between school, work, and other activities. And so Lefebvre defines rhythm as occurring wherever there is an interaction. I should actually advance my slide. I always am slow with that. Yeah, he defines rhythm as occurring wherever there is an interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy. And another part of his work that I found interesting was a distinction he makes between eurythmia and arrhythmia. Because I think it's helpful in focusing our attention on whether the multi-rhythms of social practice are harmonious and unite, or are discordant and fall apart, or somewhere in between. And so my analysis looks at working students' discussions about their movements between school and work, and just about work more generally. And I want to examine the relationship of different rhythms, as well as the extent to which these rhythms are framed around present and future lives. So the hardworking, this is based on a larger study, the hardworking student mixed methods research study, which I've been leading. And it focuses on undergraduate students at 2 large Canadian universities, and it's longitudinal. So we have talked to people on different occasions. We had a quantitative side that I referenced a few minutes ago, which was a survey at one of these universities, and we did it in 2018 and 2019. And that gave us a picture of who's working and how much, some of those kind of overview, important contextual information. And then the qualitative side of this is includes a number of data activities. So one was 22 focus groups conducted with 57 second-year undergraduates who were working at least 10 hours per week. And they were conducted in the university I'm talking about in 2018 and 2019. Interestingly, before COVID. And we do have some data, more limited, that are after. Focus groups were followed then by a life mapping activity where students talked about decisions since high school and self-recorded audio diaries and follow-up interviews. So we are kind of we have a large quantity of data, and I want to acknowledge that that I'm working on this with a number of people. So Doctors Miloš Rakov and Bob Sweet analyzed our survey data. Dr. Hangsha Shan helped collect focus group data, and UBC, our research assistants, Samina Jamal and Catalina Bobadilla, have helped with the preliminary analysis of data for this larger SSHRC-funded project. And though for this paper, I'm focusing on focus group interview data. So I'll turn now to the kind of thematic analysis and talk a little bit more. The first theme then explores the way undergraduate students talk about working hard as part of investing in the future. Student narratives both adopt and contradict commonplace discourse around the need to keep up the pace, to be efficient, and to be productive. See, it was interesting when we asked students where their ideas about work come from, many talked about parents. Although students from a wide range of backgrounds wished to emulate their parents' work ethic, that was a common thing, what that meant differed. For example, and I think these differences are important. So Dana, a white first generation, and when I say white first generation, I mean first in their family to attend university. So Dana shares that what she wants to do, as well as her father did in his career, although her father did not have a university degree. So she feels the need to, because she is attending university, to do as well. Aliyah, a first generation student from an immigrant family, on the other hand, values her father's work ethic, but would like to avoid the kind of hard work that he had to do. So she says, my dad is a welder, and like it happened that a few times I had to go and see him welding. And it's just so hard, and you have to like weld through such a difficult process, and you have to put your knees on the floor for long hours. You have to concentrate with the eyes, and they pay whatever per hour, like $40 or whatever that is per hour. And I go see my family doctor, and you wait for them 3 hours. She visits you for 5 minutes, and that's $120. So Joshua, another racialized student from an immigrant family, shares that his father worked extremely hard to become requalified. He was qualified, but had to become qualified in Canada as a health professional. And Joshua says, I don't want to disappoint him. He's worked so hard, and he's gone through all of what he's gone through. I haven't gone through anything compared to him. Finally, Kelsey, a white student with university educated parents, comments, my parents work really hard, both my parents. I'm like, hey, if I can't do that, like that kind of sucks if I'm not working as hard as them. So in these excerpts, we see that although hard work is valued by most participants, and their social positioning at the same time influences their conception of the kind of hard work that is required. And I gave the example of immigrants recertifying in a new country. The financial returns on hard work, for example, a professional versus a tradesperson. And the certainty that hard work will pay off. For example, labor, it wasn't talked about in the examples, but certainly was in the larger data set, labor market discrimination and potential and actual. And so most of our students saw at the same time, term time work is beneficial for learning how to manage their time more efficiently. Many talked about trying to fill their hours so they don't waste time. In fact, some were afraid of, it seemed, of having too much free time, which tells us a lot about the way our societal discourses, I think. Balancing school and work was seen by some, interestingly more often male students, as a form of training for future careers of hard work. Often they would talk about the kind of career they wanted to do, and it would be a career that involves, high levels of commitment and hours. The discourse of efficiency and productivity, however, was in tension with other comments, and that's what I think is interesting as well. For example, although Regina, a white domestic student, commented that the secret to her success was her calendar, she went on to share that during recent finals, she got sick. She ended up sleeping all day, staying up all night, and losing hair from stress. Drawing on Lefebvre, we might say that she was experiencing arrhythmia. Ranbir, an international student from India, stated in our initial focus group that 12 to 15-hour days as a working student was good preparation for his future career in finance. Interestingly, though, a year later, when I interviewed him, he decided that 8 to 10-hour days in real estate lending might be more appealing. He said, I would make a hell of a lot more money in investment banking, but then I think I just need to ask myself if money is more important than my sanity. Blake, a white domestic student who was working 3 jobs, also talked about work helping him. I found his use of phrase interesting. It reminded me of Palmer again, strengthening the muscles of discipline and mental resiliency. He asserts, I continuously kind of surprise myself just about how much effort and like how many hours a week I can be doing things that I don't want to be doing or things that require mental energy. But later in the same interview, he highlights the inflexibility of honors programs as an example of institutional barriers for working students. So there's a lot of kind of, on the one hand, they say this, on the other hand, and sometimes comments are quite contradictory and make one think about what's going on for students. Finally, Jeremy is an international student and he talks about the time I should move to, I've missed a couple of slides, so I'll just catch up. He talks about the need to use his time more wisely, but later comments, I'm being given so much responsibility that I don't have time to take advantage of everything that university has to offer. In order to succeed at a big university like this, you need to put all of your time and effort into succeeding the way they want us to. And that comment, the way they want us to, kind of sticks in my mind. What is that? And I think that's, again, an area that we might want to probe and think about in relation to other comments that students are making. What is the image that they have of how they're expected to succeed? Jeremy, like other international students, felt added pressure because of the high price tag for his degree. International students, as we know, pay far more tuition, and the common perception that students need to be their own wayfinders on the academic journey. These comments suggest that although students may adopt a discourse of efficiency and self-responsibility, cracks in such discourse are also apparent. Some students were clearly experiencing a sense of arrhythmia as they tried to adapt their bodily rhythms to academic and work rhythms. Further, students recognize that the idea of a wide open future that is theirs for the making is contradicted by practices of higher education institutions as well as employers. So moving to the second theme, and hopefully I'm okay for time. The second theme is rhythms and deferred gratification. Our focus on working students spotlights the interrelated rhythms of diverse bodies in classrooms and workplaces. A small proportion of students work on campus, and I think Emerson referred to work integrated learning. A small proportion work on campus in university subsidized jobs of that kind. And for them, the rhythms of term time work and academic studies tend to be more synchronized. This work is usually more highly regulated and kind of student friendly in terms of scheduling compared to other jobs. Hours of work are limited to 10 per week by one of the programs on campus. Wages are set according to university job classifications, and employers are expected to accommodate students' course schedules. In the undergraduate population overall, however, more students work off campus in jobs that aren't necessarily well synchronized with the academic timetable. Not surprisingly, students' decisions about where they work, where they study, and where they live are influenced by financial and other resources. Participants' priorities are also related to the extent to which they can imagine future work lives and their faith in the promise of higher education to realize those futures. I would venture to say that when school and work rhythms are discordant, students are inclined to prioritize what they feel, what feels most comfortable, familiar, and rewarding. For example, students who have worked since high school, whose parents are not necessarily university educated, and who may have had challenging transitions to university are likely to find the rhythms of work more satisfying. For example, Laura says, my work in a restaurant is really busy, it's really loud, it's very stimulating, and it's also very adrenaline inducing since it's so high paced. My work is kind of a stark contrast to what I do in school. In school, it's kind of isolating, being part of 200 people lectures, and it's like you're not really acknowledged. So Laura was working 23 hours a week, which was more time that she was spending studying. As additional context, she comes from a low-income immigrant family and sees working as a core part of her identity. She hasn't quite figured out what she'd like to do for a career, but thinks she'd like to change majors. She was struggling over that. And as the quote I read suggests, she sees her job as stress relief from school and is more comfortable with the energy of work rhythms. So to kind of recap and wrap up, the theme of planning and efficiency shows how students universally, it seems, adopt a discourse of hard work and time value of money, although they're clearly imprinted by their backgrounds and experiences. Most feel the need to keep up with the pace of academic life, but cracks in discourses of efficiency and productivity are apparent too, and perhaps, I would hope, provide some spaces for change. The theme of rhythms and deferred gratification looks at student narratives about time, space, and energy in relation to school and work. The university experience is seen by many as fast-paced, competitive, and stressful. Its short-term relevance is sometimes unclear, and outcomes are uncertain. Undergraduates from a range of socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds feel that school and work are arrhythmic, and shifting between their related time spaces can be exhausting. But despite this, some students are able and willing to prioritize their studies, and I think actually I'm missing slides again. I'll just move to this one. Defer gratification, particularly when they have financial support from parents, work on campus, and have sufficient faith that their efforts will be rewarded down the road in labor markets. On the other hand, students who are used to working, have worked, say, since high school and need to work to pay for school and are likely to, they may be more likely to experience the future orientation and competitive rhythms of universities as quite oppressive. This is especially true when work rhythms are more energizing or rewarding, even as they negatively impact students' capacity for academics. It's too simple to say, however, that seeking immediate gratification is more typical for students from working class backgrounds or certain racialized groups. Rather, the fast pace of academic life and high cost of tuition mean that time for students to explore career options is costly. While financially secure students may be able to take their time, put feelers out, and find something they love and can follow in the future, in the words of one student, others are more restricted because of the lack of financial and other resources. So finally, what are the implications of this discussion? I would say, first of all, we need to think about, maybe we all need to think more about changing systems of higher education and work rather than adapting to their rhythms. Faculty members and university leaders are complicit in perpetuating inequitable and unhealthy practices. Universities also need to acknowledge that students face very different situations, which have relevance for their studies and work, short-term and long-term. Policy discourse tends to oversimplify discourses and similarities across groups and ignores the complexity of student identity, I think. Finally, calls to slow down academic life mean providing resources for all students to explore and to have the gift of education. So I think I will leave it there. And I have just a few references to share and then contact information, but I believe Sherry has that as well. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Alison. Yeah, so I would invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and their microphones as we prepare for Q&As. I don't see any questions in there right now, so I'll just talk for a moment while you gather your thoughts and perhaps put a question in the Q&A. I do want to thank Sherry Fox for helping us with these webinars. Her help has just been tremendous. The CSA supports these webinars. We are on their Zoom account and Sherry sets these all up and she guides us through the whole process and all of that. And I just want to give thanks to her as we are are in our second webinar, and another one coming up in December. And watch for that email. I'll be sending, Alana will be sending that email out to announce that in the for the December webinar. Oh, I see. Oh, thank you. Alana was saying, Sherry, you're awesome. I do want to say, I was thinking a couple of thoughts as some of you are thinking of your questions to ask. I really like the quote, Alison, from a student you talked to who was talking about the move from finance to real estate, and this idea of, basically it's a trade-off between what he saw as a more successful route versus his own sanity. And to kind of tie in Emerson's talk, I was wondering too, if that translates into the types of programs that students end up filtering themselves into. I don't know if either of you would like to comment on that.
Well, I think students, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that students go into programs with a particular vision of what it will be like, and sometimes find, and that's part of the, again, the growth process, that, they're, for example, very competitive. It was interesting in certain to see differences across faculties and differences across programs in, I think, the spaces that they give students to think about some of these things. And again, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I should, name faculties, but one could probably imagine where some of the more competitive, kind of practices seem to be. And I think students, some may feel like they thrive in it, but again, some of the other comments they make, indicate that that's not necessarily the case. Even those who feel, or at least express, the kind of comfort with that kind of environment. So I think it's interesting to, again, look at tensions and contradictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
I was going to say, from, an access side, we can also think of the way that things like work integrated learning can also create some inequities when it comes to accessing higher education, because from an admissions standpoint, programs with co-op have inherently a higher admission average, right? So if you're looking to get some kind of applied learning, sometimes you can be disadvantaged if you don't have, like, I can't remember what, like sometimes like engineering with co-op is like, a 98% high school average, right? And it's like, well, if you don't have that, then you're sort of out of luck, and it can really harangue someone's, educational pathway to getting the values of higher education, right?
Great, thank you. I'm just going to check the Q&A to see. No, none.
We have a question from Catalina. Catalina has a question in the chat.
Okay.
Can you see it? Okay. Catalina's question, she has a question for both panelists. And the question is, how do your different presentations speak to each other? Do you resonate with each other's perspectives? Thank you, Catalina.
I mean, I can make a comment to start. I think it's very interesting, because we're also coming at it from, my interest is in the ways that experiential education plays out organizationally across campuses. And, by nature, I was more interested in the way that faculty members were impacted as a profession. But, I think the value that, one of the values I think that Alison's presentation has is, the student focus, right? Because oftentimes when we're talking about, it's ironic almost that lots of conversations that talk about experiential education talk about either like, implementation and forms of measurement and things, but overlook entirely the student perspective. So it was a real irony that sometimes when I have a stack of journals that I'm looking through to see what's happening in the world of experiential ed, that students sometimes aren't really mentioned or paid attention to that much. So that's one thing that I really took from Alison's is, the complex identity that is a student, right? Of traversing different fields and different expectations as they come.
Yeah, I would say that, thanks, Emerson. I think also, I mean, what is apparent in our research, as you well know, Catalina, is that a lot of learning and development occurs for students outside of class. And yet some of those activities are structured and some are not. So I think that there need to be questions, and maybe this builds on the question of access as well. I think there are good questions that can be asked about which students are able to do which kind of opportunities and why participate in different kinds of opportunities. Definitely there are differences. And I think also from the work we're doing in the Hardworking Student Project, just links between lived experience as kind of expressed by students and institutional kind of realities, whether it's the timetables, the kind of constraints in certain sense, and affordances that need to also be, I think, thought about when one is trying to understand what's going on for students. How are those experiences shaped? And so, yeah, I don't know. You should answer this too, because I think you can probably see a few. You can put it in the chat. I don't know if you're allowed to put your microphone on.
Yeah, she can add to the chat.
Yeah.
And we can see the comments there.
Yeah.
If I'll let you know if anything comes up. I was actually thinking, I noticed one of our attendees is Dr. Brittany Anmansky. So I'd like to, she does some stuff with like her PhD dissertation looked at PhD pathways, and this idea that we, graduate students, not just PhDs, but also at the MA level, need to also consider that maybe they won't get work in academia. So there's also this added nuance that perhaps also speaks to the work that both of you do in terms of, PhDs now have to be flexible to either join the ranks of academia and, the job market isn't great, or also be prepared for industry work, for research positions that come up, and how that, I don't know, Emerson, if that's something that's like an added layer to what you're looking at, but this idea that professors now, it's almost that PhDs that once were, well, we're training you to be professors, or we're training you to do that academic work. There's this nuance of, well, now we need to be a little bit more flexible in how we train our PhDs, but how do we do that?
Yeah, and I mean, you can look at the ways that different PhDs are structured over, like in my department at Waterloo, we have co-op for graduate students, right? Which speak to this transition that you of like a marketability sort of, that, not to say that inherently your PhD is without marketability. I would never say that. I'm doing one, but that it doesn't have that literal translation that it used to an academic role. So you need to explore elsewhere. There was a really interesting discussion that happened at Waterloo when I was doing my MA there about the position of graduate students and whether they were seen as like workers or as students, right? So there's that blend too of like the different hats that you wear during if you're a professor, you're a researcher, you're a teacher, you're a service person in the department. And increasingly, graduate students have these other different hats to wear, both within their department and maybe in different service committees that they get involved with across, right? So different ways that these programs are changing is really interesting to see.
Yeah, it definitely will be as we move forward.
Yeah. Oh, can I also say, Kathleen?
Yeah, definitely.
Unless there's another question, it strikes me that, even in our undergrad group, I think over half expressed an aspiration to do a master's program, right? So it's never, even a degree now is not seen as enough. So I think with the level of kind of credential inflation, and at the same time, the uncertainty about labor markets, it's an interesting time to be a student, in the sense that they are kind of, again, I think that goes back to a discourse that education is for work, and so given all the uncertainties around that, why are we still doing that in the narrow kind of way? So I think it leads to bigger questions. I see Catalina's written something.
Yeah.
Oh, she didn't. Oh no, she didn't. Oh, did she?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Alison, in your findings, or was it brought up, like, did everyone have a, particular profession in mind that they were working towards? I'm wondering about, like, entrepreneurial spirit of, like, are we going into this, if it's such a precarious labor market, like, did they have literal translation ideas that they had, or was it a little more flexible?
It varied. And that's another, I think, important part, is that some students go in, I mean, it's a time of change. So some students go in with a pretty clear idea and change. Some students don't have a clear idea through the process, and some are pretty clear. I mean, what what we would like to look at is which, what's going on, who's in some of those groups, for one thing, because it strikes me that, for example, international students who come in are, because of the amount of time and money that is tied up with their higher education, may feel more pressure to actually, make these decisions and be more planful in a number of areas, as far as, especially if they want to also open up doors to, permanent residences afterwards. And so I think there, I don't know if there's one type of student, but I think that it's important to look at the differences, and again, the implications of those differences as well, when there is a kind of certain model of a student and a successful student. And that tends to be a student who moves in a linear path across and doesn't change their mind and just keeps building so that they have this wonderful CV when they graduate, right?
Yeah, one of the projects that I'm working on the side is a project with ONCAT, and it's all about post-transition pathways of, how do transfer students integrate, but it's with a fuller recognition that there's, what was it, like the the circuit board model of educational pathways, right? But now everyone is much more flexible, and we have these like swirlers that can go in between the two, or different transfer pathways, right? That also allow us to consider that the identity of a student is much more complex than sometimes it comes across.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth also saying that, I'd like to think once upon a time, it was really high school where we would be getting students to think about what they want to do, right? What do you want to do? And but we still get, students coming into university are still very young and still, sort of figuring out what they want to be when they grow up. And I think that we assume that they're coming in knowing, right, that you've got the few sort of undecideds, and depending on your discipline, you're trying to get them to stay in yours because the numbers game, of course. But generally we think, oh, they've come to us from high school and they know what they want to do. I am just checking. I make sure I'm not missing anything.
No, nothing so far.
Okay, great. Okay, I guess what we could do is maybe have final comments from each of you, and then close the session. Emerson, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I think I'm really looking forward to seeing where this, broader conversation of experiential education takes us. I know I used to work at the Ontario University Fair, and experiential education be on all the banners, and to see the value of it. Where I sort of down the road see this research going is broadening the scope of it, to start actually talking to students about maybe a desire for experiential education frames their post-secondary decision making, right? Like maybe this comes into play, or I only want to apply to programs that have this or have that. And So there's this wide panacea of possibilities that I'm looking forward to uncovering. And I just want to say thanks again for Sherry's help, and Kathleen and Alana for moderating, and Alison, it was really nice to present alongside you.
Oh, we've got a question. Hold on, so Robert Sweet asks, could you comment on the link between workload, brackets, time, stress, and current interest in well-being? Perhaps Alison, you'd like to touch on that?
Yeah. I mean, well, so the links between time, stress, work, and well-being. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, they're quite clearly interconnected. And so again, what I think we need to be thinking about is which students, are feeling the most pressure. Again, some are working, and they tend to be the financially insecure students. So definitely most people who are working a lot and have very high, clocking many hours have some degree of stress. And sometimes, there are a variety of factors. I don't know that it's only about the hours they work, but certainly that's one area. I actually wanted to, because you were asking for a concluding comment. I thought if I have a minute, I would just read a quote from a student, because that's what I was actually looking for when this question came in, because I think it kind of sums up what this presentation has been about. And this is a student who says, you come to university and spend your first year thinking like, this is a time to grow, and I'm going to spend some time learning about myself. I think that they should circle back around to that idea. It's not necessarily just a place to get a job, which is kind of what in many places it has turned into, or like, even if it's not a job, a rat race to get to the next thing. It's like, go. How are you getting to the next thing? This is a time to learn and think about some things instead of worrying about it's expensive enough to just be here. It's a whole other thing to be here, plus be 5 years into your future, 10 years into your future. So I think the stress is not just, again, one factor. I think what I was trying to indicate in the presentation is that universities stress students out, not just the fact that they are working in addition to university. In fact, sometimes university students stress them out more than their work, and their work is actually a valuable thing for that reason. They don't find the same pressure. So I think we need to look at, both. Of course, work needs to be thought about, and when students are working certainly almost full time in addition to studying full time, it's a very difficult situation. But I think we also, as university people, need to be thinking about what we're doing. So.
Thank you. I'm just doing one last check to make sure I haven't missed anyone. Okay, great. Thank you. Sherry's going to, yes, thank you so much, Alison and Emerson, for joining us today. And yeah, Sherry's going to show that final slide. So if you have any extra questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Sherry has the contact information there. And certainly, I think Alison and Emerson would welcome extra questions, if you think of something after. But we thank all of you for joining us today. We thank our presenters, and we wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.